because they've said their security is a lot better than their tech security.
Did you get into any trouble at the time?
Found someone in the corridor and said, I'm having a heart attack. I spent half my student loan on a huge freezer and put it in my room.
Oh, you were going to do it out of your bedroom?
It was only about 12 years ago that the medical community thought that it was only a boy issue.
On the podcast today, I'm joined by Partridge. Alex, how are you doing?
Yeah, good, thank you. Thanks for the invite.
No problem. Thank you for coming in. I've been a huge fan of yours, both in business, but now in terms of everything that you're doing with your podcast and raising awareness for ADHD. So I think this is going to be a bit of a different podcast to a lot of the podcasts that I've talked to people about before, because it's always been about social media. It's always been about business. And I think this will have some elements of that. But I think it would be great for us to talk about ADHD. And I think I'd love to talk about how ADHD has affected your career. But to begin with, I always like to go back, I guess, to the beginning, if you will, and talk about what you were like as a kid, what you were like growing up, and kind of how you got into business.
Yeah, as a kid, I think if you looked at my school reports, I think you'd probably read that I was very quiet, had potential, but sat at the back of the class, didn't really get involved, didn't really have many friends. I wasn't like a very sociable person. I'd kept myself to myself. So when I was really young, I just collected Warhammer and put myself in my room and painted. But I was very happy. Like, it sounds quite like lonely, but I was very, very happy doing that, keeping myself to myself. That's
quite opposite to what you would, I guess, it's opposite of the tale that maybe you'd get for most ADHD kids. So the label that they always get is loud, disruptive, naughty. Like, that's what I would have been told about my friends who had ADHD when I was a kid. So that's quite interesting to hear that you were kind of the opposite of that.
Yeah, I mean, that's really why I felt compelled to do the work that I'm doing now around ADHD, because the more I looked into it, and I realized that actually that is true sometimes, but that is a stereotype, and it can really show up in different ways. Like, for me, it's so internalized. The hyperactivity isn't physical.
Yeah.
So in class, even though I was sat at the back, not acting out, not throwing stones at the windows, whatever the stereotype is of ADHD, like, for me, it was in my head, my racing thoughts constantly, causing anxiety. I remember sat in a class and the teacher singled me out and said, "Alex, do you know the answer to this question?" And I just felt my face like going red and my heart speeding up and my palms getting sweaty. And I stood up and I ran out of the room and found someone in the corridor and said, "I'm having a heart attack." And I wasn't having a heart attack. I was having an anxiety attack.
Yeah.
Like, for me, like, the hyperactivity in the ADHD has always been in my head. And that's really, if I look back, that's the first kind of like sign of it. And we can talk about later on how I've dealt with that anxiety as an adult. But for me, like, when I realized that penny dropped, that the H in ADHD, that hyperactivity doesn't always mean physical.
No.
And it can be like in your head. That was like, wow, I need to be one of the people who are speaking out and raising awareness about this.
And when you were a kid, and again, we can talk about how you've dealt with it as an adult, but when you were a kid, how did you release that hyperactivity in your head? Like, did you have outlets that you were able to release it?
Not really. Like, I didn't really have like many friends. I played a lot of computer games. That was probably my vice at the time. I was never into anything that got me into any trouble. I just remember being very anxious, and I remember a couple of times it boiled over into a full-blown anxiety attack, and not really knowing what was causing it at the time. And I remember when I was really young, I'm getting put on anti-anxiety medication when my parents just didn't know what was going on, and they took me to my GP, and we were saying about the anxiety, and like so many people who don't realize that the ADHD hyperactivity can be internalized, they get misdiagnosed with anxiety and put on, when actually the underlying reason is ADHD.
And at the time, was there any talk of ADHD?
No, there was one person in my school who was out, like who was like, "I have ADHD." And he was your typical sort of, and he really was like the stereotype and of what a lot of people think ADHD is.
Do you think there was an element of, I don't know, like misunderstanding of what ADHD was even from the professionals back then? Because the fact that it was just never even talked about in terms of your case is quite surprising, really. And just to label it as anxiety and that's it. Do you think there was a bit of a lack of understanding?
Oh, massively. I mean, it was only about 12 years ago that the medical community thought that it was only a boy issue.
Yeah.
Like women just couldn't get it.
Yeah.
And now we know that women get it just as much, if not more, than men. And it's because there's a number of theories. I think it's because women are taught that they have to act a certain way and they can't act out on the impulses and the hyperactivity that they feel like they should do because they've got that dopamine deficiency and they need to release it. But because they're female and society says that women should be polite and well behaved, they keep it internalized.
So after, it was diagnosed as anxiety, what was life like after then in school? Were you able to manage that better? Did the medication help? Or did it just never really rectify itself?
Not really. My parents swapped me from one school to another.
Right, okay.
I remember my dad chasing me around the garden because I just wouldn't get in the car to go to school. And they were just getting frustrated because they didn't realize what was going on. And nor did I, nor did anyone. I was just so terrified of going to school. I just associated that building with what happened that day with that anxiety attack and just the fear of just going back to it. So my parents swapped me from one school to another and then nothing changed. And then I went to college. It was just constant, really, the anxiety. There was no one, the anxiety medication didn't work because that wasn't addressing like the root problem. That wasn't slowing down that mind.
And then you went off to university, right?
Yeah.
And what about there? Like, for most kids going into university, just going to university causes most people anxiety. It's a brand new set of friends. It's, some people absolutely thrive. Some people goes completely the opposite way. What was it like when you went into the university environment?
So it took me a while to go to university because I just associated anything that had like a classroom setting with that anxiety attack. So I had 2 gap years and nothing really was happening.
Right.
I was working in hotels. So eventually I thought that I would just apply to go to university. And I remember I went to my first lecture and it was like a replica of that panic attack that I had when I was at school.
Yeah.
I sat at the back of the lecture theatre at Oxford Brookes and and again, I just felt that heart racing going and my face going red and my palms getting sweaty. And I left the lecture theatre and I never went back. But I never told my parents. I never told anyone. I was just in my room. And that's when I started my first business. Business was the only thing that ever took that anxiety away, weirdly.
Well, that's what's quite interesting. And I wanted to get onto that. Before you got to university, had you ever and I always find this quite interesting with anybody who's entrepreneurial, is when they first started showing signs of having that kind of entrepreneurial itch or the tendencies for it. And you've heard all the stories in the world about entrepreneurs that from the age of 4 was going into school and selling sweets. Were you that kid, or was it not until you got to university that you realized that you had this itch of entrepreneurship that you needed to itch?
So I didn't think it was at the time, but looking back, I think you would describe it as entrepreneurialism. When I was 5 or 6, I was going through all the board games in my parents' house and finding the addresses of the manufacturers of these board games. And I spent 2 weeks designing my own board game, doing all the branding, making all the pieces.
Oh, wow. That is very, very entrepreneurial.
But that's just what I did. When my friends were out playing football, I was in the house creating a board game and sending it off to all these companies. And I didn't hear anything for a couple of weeks. And one of them replied back, and he probably could tell that I was 5 or 6 because of my handwriting. And he said, we're not looking for any new designs at the moment, but always. And I remember so clearly, the letter said, always lean into this entrepreneurial spirit. And I didn't know what that word was at the time.
Wow.
So it was clearly unusual behavior at the time. But looking back, I think you definitely describe it as entrepreneurial.
And then when you're at university, it was at university that you started Unilad?
Yeah.
Right? And how did that come about? Tell us the story of I know you've told it a million times, but tell us a story of how the idea came about, how it first came into practice.
Yeah, so I was in my second. There was a business in my first year, but like I lost interest in that. And in my second year, I started dating this other student called Eleanor, and she was this editor of an online student magazine.
Right.
And yeah, to cut a long sort of romantic story short, we broke up, and that was the first time I had experienced heartbreak, genuine heartbreak. And I remember just sat in my room, just absolutely devastated, like desperate to try and win her back. And I just thought that if I started something similar to her, that she would think we had something in common, and it would start up again. So that was how Unilad came about.
No way. That's amazing. What, just out of interest, just quickly, what was the business that you started prior to Unilad, in the first year?
So it was a late night pizza delivery company. I spent half my student loan on a huge freezer, put it in my room.
Oh, you were going to do it out of your bedroom?
Yeah. Filled it with Tesco pizzas and made a Facebook page. It was called Quick Pizza. And I put my phone number on the profile picture on Facebook, and really simple idea. It was like, when the shops are shut after a club, text me, I'll put a pizza in the oven. I had 4 people cycling around Oxford delivering these pizzas. I mean, it was going really well. This was before Deliveroo.
I was going to say, it's like the initial Deliveroo.
Yeah, but then I think now, looking at it through the ADHD lens, it was one of those ideas that I got like so excited about, and I went all in. Within 24 hours, I'd spent 300-400 quid on this huge freezer and filled it with pizzas. But then a week later, I'd lost interest in it, and it just didn't carry on. So that, looking back, I would say is through the lens of ADHD, is that boom and bust cycle of starting something, going all in, and then losing interest a week later.
That is something that I really, really want to touch on, because I think that that's such a powerful message for anybody with ADHD who is in business right now. I've certainly gone through that boom and bust cycle in my own businesses, and the ways in which I even do things in my current business. It's like I get obsessed with something for a few days, and then it's just out the window. It's like, no, get back to what you're supposed to be doing. But just quickly, because I know a lot of people will be interested. So you launched this love affair of a business, effectively. And when does it start to take off?
Well, there's an interesting story. I mean, I made the Facebook page, I set up the website, and then I had a friend who was a computer science student, and I was getting a bit frustrated because I wanted to get the numbers up quickly so I could impress Eleanor. And I said to my friend, is there a way we can hack into the university database to get all of these email addresses to market out Unilad? And he said, yes, I know how to do it. I'm not going to do it because it can get you into a lot of trouble. But no, he taught me how to do it. And within an afternoon, I had thousands of student email addresses that I was then mailing out all of the Unilad content. And the funny thing is, the Oxford Brooks have invited me back twice to speak, and they've said their security is a lot better than their tech security.
Did you get into any trouble at the time of doing that?
No, I did it for like a week, and I don't think they knew until I had told that story publicly years later. So by that time, they were quite proud of me, and I was an alumni and all this kind of stuff. So I thought it was quite funny. But yeah, I mean, it was a pretty serious security breach at the time.
That's amazing. And what was it like once the like Unilad and later on LADbible started to take off? And I guess this is a good kind of segue into talking about business through the ADHD lens. What was it like going from just yourself running these pages to starting to bring on staff, starting to bring on other people that you needed to rely upon to run a business? Like, looking back now, how did that affect you personally? Because from what you've kind of, and I've heard you talk about before, you get hyper focused on things. You can focus on things for hours on end. Not everybody can do that. How did you find it in terms of building a team around you to begin with?
Yeah, I had to get well, first off, as soon as I got an email from, I think it was Domino's Pizza, that said, like, I'll give you X amount to be featured on the page, I very impulsively dropped out of university, and that was the sort of validation I needed. And I just, that same day, I had gone, right, okay, I'm leaving Oxford, and I went back home.
Right.
And that's when I started to build out a team. Right. I had to get a web designer for starters, a team of writers.
Yeah.
So suddenly it went from just me to around 8 people, which was obviously now it's like, and I've got nothing to do with it anymore, but a couple of years after that, it was like 400 or 500. So, but from 1 person to 8 people, suddenly I had this management role as well.
Yeah.
And I remember feeling it was distracting, I found, for the hyperfocus. Like I found it quite overwhelming. At first, I managed to organize it in a way that we had a Facebook group called like Unilad writers. So it was quite organized, and that took away that initial overwhelm.
Okay.
But yeah, it was definitely overwhelming. And I also, the sort of side of me that likes to be in control and to have complete oversight, which I did, but suddenly having all of these writers and and a web designer, it wasn't just me anymore.
Yeah.
Which was, I think with anything, it when something goes from just you in a bedroom to 7 or 8 people, that adds anxiety, that adds stress. But I think that initial Facebook group, and that taught me a really more broad lesson. Like you have to, if you are the type of person that gets overwhelmed, like find an organizational tool or some way to keep it manageable in your head.
I found massively that the hardest step for me in business went from just being myself to being a team of 3 or 4 was a way harder step than it has been from like 3 to now a team of 20-ish, 20 people. That step from 3 to 20 was way easier than 1 to 3 or 4, because that 1 to 3 and 4 was so hard to organize, because you were having to give away, as you just said, certain levels of control while still having oversight, while not micromanaging, while wanting to keep standards where you need them to be. And I can imagine through the ADHD lens, as you say, that can be quite challenging. In terms of when the business started to grow, and looking back now, you've mentioned, and we were talking about it before the podcast, that when you first found out that you had when you were diagnosed with ADHD, you saw and you came out and you championed it being a superpower. Whereas now you've kind of pulled back on that, and you've said that it's very much there are good elements and bad elements of having ADHD. Talking about business and your career and looking back at it now, what were the main strengths for you throughout that period of running Unilad and LADbible that came from the ADHD?
Yeah, I mean, like as you mentioned, the hyperfocus was absolutely paramount.
Yeah,
I remember from day one that hyperfocus of just not leaving my room for weeks on end. Now my housemates in Oxford will tell you at the time they were genuinely concerned about my welfare because I just didn't leave my room for weeks and weeks, other than to eat and drink. It was just that complete obsession and that like ability to zone out everything that was going on around me, and everyone was going out drinking, being students, and I was just absolutely obsessed with it. Within a week I'd learned how to make a website on Weebly. Everything that you needed to do, the branding, the theme, everything like that would probably take months and months and months, and a strategy, and about 48 hours I was just locked in. And I 100% associate that with ADHD, hyperfocus, and I'm experiencing it now with the podcast. I had the idea, and within, again, like it was 5 months ago, I had this idea to do the podcast, and within a day I had the logo, the strategy for how it was going to grow. I knew what type of content I was going to make, and here we are 5 months later and 400,000 followers later, and it's just blown up. And it's I can see that it's taking the same path that Unilad did, and I 100% attribute that to that hyperfocus and that ability to see patterns, and to look at past trends and see what's going to resonate on social media. It was Facebook back in 2010, and now it's on other platforms, but it's that same part of my brain that's like can look at the pattern recognition combined with the hyperfocus. But the why I wouldn't call it a superpower is that I've got to be very careful, because when I'm in that hyper focus and obsession, like my brain is firing. I'm like, I'm loving life. That's like where, from an outsider, I would probably look quite lonely. I'm in my office, just on my computer. There's a cost to that, right? Like friendships, don't have any relationships. You know, it's a struggle. Family, don't speak to them for long periods of time, and I have to so there's a cost to that. And also when I step away from that hyper focus, and suddenly I'm not getting that dopamine from social media, there's a void in my head. And I found out the really hard way that if you don't have that self-awareness, you look for it in unhealthy ways. And I've been hospitalized 3 times through binge drinking. And that was always when I stepped away from the dopamine loop that like Facebook or now Instagram or TikTok gives me.
Because that's something that, if you're okay to talk about it, I'd love to talk about in that, listening back to your story and your podcasts, those outlets that you've talked about, that dopamine chasing that resulted in the drinking. Did that spike as the business grew and the stresses grew?
It was okay at the beginning. Because with Unilad especially, there was a court case. And that's really, I think I learned during that court case that a major trigger of mine is confrontation.
Right, okay.
And so that was super interesting. I didn't know that before. And suddenly when you're fighting in the courts for your company back, and actually that's really like probably the biggest confrontation I'll ever experience in my life. And I remember when my solicitor called me up and said, this isn't going to reach a settlement. You're going to have to go to court. And just my mind raced forward. And I could almost see myself on that witness box getting cross-examined and having to answer back to their barristers. And I remember that day I just got in my car and drove to the petrol station and got 2 bottles of wine. And I've never drank so quickly. I've never seen myself drink like that as well before that day. So now I'm very careful as well about what I expose myself to. And I think there's a massive element with ADHD, looking at it through that lens as well, is this whole sensitivity to rejection and criticism. And for me, I look back and actually that was like a major trigger. So it was a confrontation, but actually I looked at it as a personal criticism. Like, why would they kick me out of the company?
That's very interesting. What you say there about being sensitive to rejection and criticism and all those kind of things, that's really interesting to me, because one of the things we talked about before the podcast is that one of the major reasons why I want to talk to you and other people with ADHD is because for years people have said I've got ADHD, and I'm like, whatever, you just think I'm hyperactive, or I get super focused, or I can be quite rude and abrasive sometimes. But one of the things that has also triggered this is that, and it might not come across from an external point of view, but I hate the thought of rejection and criticism, and it's something that completely drives me in everything that I do. And I think that's something that's probably not talked about that much with ADHD. So how did that affect you throughout your career? Like, was it a case of you were always conscious of people, trying to please people in business or people around you?
I think so, subconsciously. And I think that's probably I think it's generally an insecurity that motivates what society would define a successful person. I don't think it's someone chasing the good stuff. I think it's probably them running away from the fear of the bad stuff. And for me, it's like that if something doesn't go right, or I think someone's perceiving me as unsuccessful or criticizing me because I haven't done as well as I could do, and I don't know where that comes from, but that's such an uncomfortable feeling. I almost have like a phobia of that feeling and that rage that I know can bubble up sometimes if someone criticizes me. Or it doesn't even need to be a real rejection or a real criticism. It could be the slightest thing that I perceive to be a criticism. And suddenly that's like the next 2 hours, I've lost rationale. I almost like, and you see it, it's rejection sensitive dysphoria. It's very common amongst the ADHD community. You just see red and you lose like the ability to, now I'm aware of it. When that happens, I step back, I try not to react, and I always calm down and I look back and I'm like, good job. I'm so thankful that I didn't say anything in that moment, because in the past with relationships and other things, I've reacted in that moment. And I always regret, like, the stuff I say in those moments.
Did you, because obviously like we've discussed, you've only recently been diagnosed with ADHD. So maybe, 5-6 years ago, you didn't have that self-awareness. Do you kind of wish now you had that self-awareness back then when you were kind of running the company? Because I can imagine that having that back then would have given you even more of an advantage over the ADHD.
Yeah, I think so. You have to be but I'm so careful what I expose myself to now.
Yeah.
And when things, obviously, it's part of human life, right? You get criticized sometimes and you have to deal with that. And now I'm aware that how I react to it and how common that is with ADHD. Looking back, I think there weren't really you have to go through the negative reactions to recognize that you are part of that community.
Yeah.
Because if I didn't react in a certain way at the time, I wouldn't recognize rejection sensitivity dysphoria in myself.
Right. What about, and it's very similar to rejection. What about comparison? Did you ever find yourself comparing yourself to other people, maybe the peers or competitors a lot when you were coming, even now, do you find yourself comparing yourself to other people?
Yeah, massively. And it's really unhealthy. I only ever compare up.
Yeah.
But maybe that's human nature.
Probably, yeah.
I'm always looking at, I'm comparing myself with the people who are who are ahead of me.
Yeah.
And actually I should be looking and say, look how far I've come.
Yeah.
But I'm always looking up and saying, oh, they're ahead. And that is a motivator. But then you can never win that race.
No.
Because there's always going to be someone who is further ahead in whatever field that you're in. But I've heard a lot of entrepreneurs talk about that. But yeah, I should learn to compare down more and be grateful and be self-appreciative of how far I've come, rather than always not thinking that I'm always below someone else.
It's hard, isn't it? Because if you got rid of that want to compare yourself up, how else you've got to find other ways then to create that motivation to keep going, to keep driving forward, to keep getting, now get your podcast better, because I'm sure you compare it to other podcasts and what they're doing. But when you're running a business, you're comparing it to people that are doing it better than you. But as you're saying, on self-reflection, people would look at you and go, look what you made. And I want to do what Alex has done. And it is quite difficult to sometimes sit back and just reflect on that. And that's where the self-awareness probably comes in. So obviously you mentioned the drinking and that's obviously was a huge negative in terms of ADHD, but specifically in terms of business, what were some of the things that you think ADHD caused a negative reaction in terms of when you were, running your companies?
Probably just stuff to do with executive function, I think.
Right.
And simple things like perhaps being bad at timekeeping or being bad at using a calendar, being bad at just general organizational skills, all stuff that now I know is classic ADHD behavior, not having that executive function that you need to be organized. And at the time I didn't know that I lacked that, or I needed help in that situation. So I didn't have the awareness to ask for help.
It's just really interesting because I think that, as you mentioned, the label of ADHD, not everybody's the same. There will be some people with ADHD who are probably good at timekeeping or good at using a calendar. They might not be able to get hyper-focused, and it's on a spectrum, if you will. But I think it's a really powerful message for anybody who's listening, or anybody who's got kids who've got ADHD who are listening, and they're thinking, oh, I want to start a business, or I want to be successful, but I've got ADHD and I'm just getting told that I'm a naughty kid, or I can't pass my exams, whatever it may be. To hear from the likes of you and to really, start listening to, and I think one of the best things that you're doing right now is your new podcast, well, not new anymore, but, newish podcast, ADHD Chatter. Because I've been listening to it and hearing from this range of people that have got ADHD and the amazing careers that they're having, but also listening to how different they are. hasn't been one guest, I think, so far that I've listened to and I've gone, you're exactly the same as the other person. And their description of ADHD and the effects on their life has been completely different. What's it been like for you reflecting on being able to talk to so many people with just different experiences of it?
It's been an eye-opener to echo what you said and to really show how it shows up differently. There's a famous saying, you meet one person with ADHD, you've just met one person with ADHD, because that's why I always start the episode with the same question. And I say, how does ADHD show up in yourself? What's your earliest memory of displaying ADHD traits?
Yeah.
And sure, there's some crossovers, but generally each answer is very unique. But people with ADHD are 400% more likely to start their own business. Like, we're attracted to the entrepreneurial lifestyle. And speaking for myself and echoing what my guests have said, it's that like impulsivity, and that fearlessness, and that inability to dwell on failure. Because I started, going back to when I messaged the board game companies and that business I started at Oxford Brookes, and there were like 7 in between them, right? But they all failed. But I wasn't able to dwell on them. I think some people might
move on very quickly from
that.
So that is so interesting, and that's what we're talking about, this boom and bust cycle of that you can get focused on something. If it doesn't work, great, on to the next thing. Do you also think you mentioned then about, and I didn't know that you're 400% more likely to start a business if you've got ADHD. Is there an element of that because maybe somebody with ADHD can't fit into the square holes of somebody that needs to fit within a big organization, having a quote unquote proper job? There's elements of that, they might, if they can't time keep correctly, or they can't keep to a calendar or wherever it may be. Do you think there's elements of that to it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the entrepreneurial lifestyle lends itself to, no day is going to be the same. There'll be similarities, but you couldn't get further from a mundane 9-to-5 office job. It's why we see a lot of people with ADHD subconsciously going into the emergency services or really fast-paced jobs where one day is not going to be the same as the other.
Right.
And you see, that's why I'm doing a lot of work now to raise awareness of how businesses can better accommodate neurodivergence and specifically ADHD, because putting an ADHD person, from my experience, into an office where they just have to do the same mundane task every day, 9 till 5, the outcomes are really bad. People leave the jobs. They get really anxious. They get really depressed because their mind just isn't wired to function well over a long period of time, perhaps for a couple of months until that kind of honeymoon period fades. And then you see retention rate of ADHD staff pretty low in what you would consider to be a normal 9-to-5 job.
And what are some of the things, I guess, then businesses can do to make their office space or just the roles that people are working in more accommodating for people with ADHD? Because as you said, and as we've talked about, no, 2 people are the same. So you can't just do blanket changes across organizations. But what are some of the things that may help in those situations?
I think you've got to really broadcast to your staff that you're open to listening first, and to make it a safe place for people with neurodiversity, because so many people just don't feel safe enough to disclose their diagnosis. And we can get into the legal side of it. It is a disability. They have a legal obligation to put reasonable adjustments in place if once an employee has disclosed. Bring in a neurodivergent speaker. That's a big signal that you're a safe place. Have a adjustments policy. Let people work from home. That's the big one. And that simple swap up of environment can be enough. Let people come in later, maybe an hour later, so they don't get overwhelmed by the rush hour traffic. Little things like that, because there's a lot of sensory overload in the community. Normalize the use of fidget spinners, fidget toys, and standing desks. For me and a lot of people in the community, sat at a table in front of a computer screen can be paralyzing. But a simple thing like if you're allowed to stand, and that kind of culture is just normalized. And if someone brings in noise cancelling headphones and stands whilst they're working, that's not a big deal, and that kind of culture is normalized?
I think it comes down to education, doesn't it? Because you just talking then, I'm thinking about our office where our company is, and it is just a big square room, and everybody sits at the same desks, and they sit there all day. And we're only in Mondays and Wednesdays, but everybody's encouraged to be in Mondays and Wednesdays for the whole time to work together. But there's a lack of education behind this for most companies, that I wouldn't even think that something as simple as a standing desk, or changing up your work environment, whether it be work from home or being able to book a meeting room and just focus for a few hours. That obviously doesn't come across a lot of people's minds who haven't thought about this before. So how do you think that businesses kind of better educate themselves on this? Obviously, they can listen to your podcast, which is great. But what else?
Bring in trainers.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot, like we mentioned Matt Gutwell, who was the first guest on my podcast. That's what he does. And, there's many people like him. Matt Gutwell is very good. Yeah. His job is to go in and educate business owners and managers, how to recognize neurodiversity, the benefits of having a neurodivergent workforce, and what things you can put in place to enable them to feel that they're in a safe space where they can work to the best of their ability. Yeah, like that's got to be the first thing you do, is bring in a trainer. A lot of people know, they've heard the word neurodiversity, but they haven't got a clue where to start. No, like it's not expensive. Bring in a trainer and just have an afternoon, have a workshop. Just let someone come in, do an audit on your business, and say you only need to make a few little changes. It's not expensive to make it more accommodating.
Yeah. Kind of taking it, it's a bit of a segue, but taking it back to December when you got your diagnosis, why did you go for a diagnosis? Like what had happened for you to go, I need to go see if I've got ADHD?
So I suspected it for a couple of years.
Right.
I mean, I started seeing a little bit of content on social media, and I reflected back to my previous businesses, going back to that boom and bust cycle. And then the catalyst was I started a podcast called Walk Away Wiser, and I got so excited about it. I literally turned my main bedroom in my flat into this podcast studio.
I listened to one of your podcast episodes where you're talking about that you bought everything that you could buy for a podcast.
Yeah, I spent a small fortune. Literally all of the equipment you see here, I turned my bedroom into this, basically. A proper set. And the postman turned up delivering it all, and I didn't want to do it anymore. And the guy I had hired to be the director said, when did you get your ADHD diagnosis? Because he had ADHD and he recognized this behavior.
Oh, really?
And I just looked at him with confusion, because I didn't have a diagnosis. And he said, well, this is, amongst other things, clear ADHD behavior. You've literally invested 20,000 quid in turning your bedroom into a studio a week ago, and now you don't want to do it. So that was the most expensive boom and bust cycle, and that was really what led me down the rabbit hole of going into Google and looking at various resources and seeking an assessment. And the psychiatrist said it was clear as hell, my ADHD.
And so it's taken about 2 years to get that diagnosis, because that's something that I was talking to somebody about today, a friend that has ADHD, and they were talking about how long it takes to actually go through that process. So how long it took the whole 2 years to get a diagnosis?
No. So I, like many people, I went private.
Right. Okay.
So mine took about 6 weeks.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay.
Which a lot of people, I could afford it. A lot of people are going private because when they want a diagnosis so they can get medication, they're in such a critical stage. So they'll often pay to go private. They'll take out a loan, or they'll sell their car so they can, because the NHS at the moment is 2 years if you're lucky, 7 years if you're unlucky. 7
years?
In some areas of the UK, yeah.
So I was talking to Jay Beach, who's on our roster, and I know who's on your podcast. And he was talking about how long it took him to get his diagnosis, because he moved house and he was changing boroughs, and it just took a lifetime to get diagnosed. And again, I'm not going to say typical, because nothing's typical in life, let alone in neurodivergent, but what are some typical traits of somebody that might have ADHD? If a parent's listening and they're looking at their kids and thinking, oh, I might see if I take them to see if they could get diagnosed. What are some typical traits of ADHD?
I mean, the main ones are impulsivity. I think impulsivity is, for me, and just broadly, like the main one. Concentration, not being able to finish tasks, getting super excited about something and abandoning it. They're probably the main ones. And it's that there's lots of comorbidities, and I don't really like that word, but that's things that come with it. So that anxiety, that depression, that low self-esteem, because you don't, it alleviates when you get an understanding. You don't need a diagnosis to get that. I've always say, like, getting a diagnosis is for the privileged. Yeah. Because you either pay 900 quid to get one quite quickly, or you have to wait a long time. There is something called right to choose, which is definitely worth speaking to your GP about, where the NHS pay for the private fee. Right. If you're eligible, that's worth like going down that rabbit hole if you are considering a diagnosis. But yeah, it's that impulsivity, fidgeting, concentration, all things that are considered normal requirements to function.
So it's so interesting though, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you're talking about you can be hyper focused and get tasks done so well, but then on the other hand, you're talking about not being able to get tasks done as another symptom. So it's just a minefield to try and figure out what is a symptom and what's not a symptom, or the fact that you say that they just change so frequently.
Yeah, I mean, and that's another thing that why so many people feel misunderstood, because there's these glaring contradictions in how it can present. If you get triggered, for example, with rejection sensitive dysphoria, like your traits can be completely different that day. If you're having a good day and you've discovered something, you're hyper focused on it, then you'll be more productive than anyone. And you could get more done in those 2 days than anyone. And I think in that situation, that's when, it can get considered to be a superpower. But okay, maybe the next day you've been triggered by something, or something negative has happened, and suddenly you can't get out of bed for 2 days. So it's that inconsistent part of it that it makes it quite hard to live with.
So that's I'm conscious of not trying to like talk about myself on this, because I very much want to talk to you about your diagnosis and your journey. But me thinking about the potential of going for an ADHD diagnosis, a lot of the stuff you're saying is triggering a lot of stuff for me about the way in which I do things, the way in which I talk to people, and that kind of up and down depending on the situation you're in, the up and down and the focus depending on your interest level in a project. Did you find yourself, the moment that what usually happens with me is, and I just want to see if this is similar, if I'm interested in something, you can't stop me. I'm on it all day, every day. My wife tries to pull me away from stuff. She can't. I'm on my laptop. I'm on my laptop in bed. She's trying to make me shut it, whatever it may be. But the moment something is not interesting to me, I physically can't focus on it. It's not that I'm being rude, and sometimes and it's the same with conversations. If I'm super interested in a conversation, I want to be in it forever. But then at the moment I'm not interested in a conversation, or like I've thought about the next task I have to complete, I'm out of that conversation in my head, and I'm on to sometimes I'm on my phone and I'm still talking to somebody. And is that similar to the kind of situation that kind of you go through, or you've been through?
Yeah, 100%. And I think it would be quite easy for someone listening to say, well, everyone just does that. Of course, if you're not interested in something, you're not going to enjoy doing it anymore. But I think if you look at a neurotypical person who's going through that cycle, their interest and disinterest might sort of be a little wave. But with someone with ADHD, that interest is like massive spike and then huge dip to the point where you're literally incapable of doing anything. Yeah. I sort of like compare it to if I go out for dinner, like to a restaurant, and the food turns up and I'm getting like this huge dopamine rush from the food. And as soon as I'm finished, I want to leave instantly. I get frustrated like when the waiter doesn't bring the bill over straight away, to the point where I'm like, I can't engage with like conversation with who I'm with. Like as soon as that excitement is gone, like, I want to get out of the restaurant, pay the bill. That's why I love Nando's, because you pay before you eat, so you can just go as soon as the food's done.
I've literally just got back from holiday where we were going out for dinner, and it's the same. I'm exactly the same, but it's more than that. It's if I'm in certain situations where, great example, you're getting ready to go out with family and friends, and you're going to leave at 6, and everybody else is ready, and there's a few people still getting ready. I know that it's just like a thing that all families go through, but I'm like, why are we not ready? Like, why? Like, I need to have left. It's 6. I need to have gone. That is something for me that I just think it's just my personality. That's just the way I am. But that's some of the things, listening to your podcast and hearing about other people talk about it, it seems to be one of the reasons why I want to try and get a diagnosis. Because the other thing that, and I know we're going off tangent a little bit, but I think this might be helpful for people. Another video that you put out, and I think you put it on your LinkedIn, was all about eye contact, which genuinely was the first time I'd ever heard anybody talk about it in this way, that explained exactly what my brain goes through when I'm having eye contact. Because for me, I am way better at focusing on what you're saying if I'm not looking you in the eye. But that's not what we're taught as kids or growing up. You know, you need to look people in the eye and you need to be respectful. But the moment I look at someone in the eye, my brain turns off. And I'm better at listening to somebody by looking at them in the eye. But the moment I start talking and I really want to focus on what I'm saying, I almost have to look away, because the rest of my brain's going, am I staring at you too much? Am I staring at this eye? Am I staring at this eye? And you put out a video talking about that, and that really hit home to me. Have you always had that growing up?
Yeah, always. And it's only recently that I've discovered how common that is within the neurodivergent community, whether that's ADHD or autism. Eye contact is deeply uncomfortable and distracting. Like you said, I can listen to you. But if I'm talking, if I'm looking at you in the eyes, then I suddenly lose my articulation, and I'll probably carry on speaking, but I'm aware that what I'm saying is actually not as articulate as I could be. So then I just get like self-conscious. But yeah, it's always been there, definitely. Very common. Like eye contact is deeply uncomfortable for a lot of people, and it can paralyze the mind. I mean, we're getting into the conversation of masking. You know, we're taught that eye contact is polite. We're taught that when you go into a job interview, you should, firm handshake and make good eye contact, because that was what society deems as appropriate and good manners. But for a lot of people, you're not going to get the best out of them if they're trying to maintain eye contact, because that's just them doing what they've been taught they should be doing. When, but if their brain isn't working as optimally as if they were allowed to just look over there when they're speaking, but then society says that's weird. So yeah, we're getting into the conversation of masking, which is a complex one. And the more I do the podcast and the more I understand about ADHD and neurodiversity, I think the more I realize I do mask massively.
Well, what do you do that even you're doing maybe now that you mask?
I mirror people. Like if I meet someone for the first time, I will, because I'm such a big people pleaser, I'll even like replicate their voice or their tone of voice or their posture. Because I'm like, I don't know what it is, like a subconscious desire to be liked and to be, to not annoy anyone. I am very aware that if there's more than one, if I'm interacting with more than just one person, I can almost go like non-verbal. I just get so anxious. I can't, if there's too many people speaking, I can't think at all. So I'll just sit there at a dinner table and I won't say anything for like 5 minutes. And then because I haven't said anything for 5 minutes, that will make it worse. Because then I'll be getting anxious, thinking they think I'm weird because I haven't said anything for 5 minutes. Like one-to-one, I'm really good, I think. Up till a certain period, when my attention goes, like you mentioned earlier, like it's not me being rude. It's just like, okay, that's enough for now. Half an hour, whatever. And then it's like, okay, well, that's enough for today. I need to recharge my batteries, my social batteries now, and then we can carry this on. But yeah, masking is, it's essentially like just changing who you are, not being your true self to fit in. And definitely do, me in my flat, with Tanya, my girlfriend, is a very different Alex to what I am out and about. But there's an element of like, everyone's like that in a sense. You sort of conform to society's expectations.
I guess everybody, whether you've got ADHD or otherwise, everybody masks in some way, shape, or form. I think it's just, again, listening to your podcast, and it is a very complex issue. It's a question of, should people with ADHD be masking to appease, the wider population? No. And I think that it's a really important conversation, because, as you say, like the conversation piece, in terms of once you've, because I find this a lot. I feel like if you're with your friends and you're just like, I'm just done with this conversation, that's kind of okay. Like you can kind of get away with that. But in business and in everyday life, it's harder to be that honest with people. And that's where you start masking. You have to be polite to people, because if not, you come across as an arsehole. And you don't want to come across as an arsehole, especially when you're in a business situation. And I find myself quite a lot, again, and kind of what you were saying there, once I tend to keep meetings very short, to kind of hone in on the important aspects of that meeting, because I know that 20 minutes in or 15 minutes in, my brain will wander on to the next task. And I think that sometimes it's quite funny when I started the agency with my wife. So my wife still worked in the business, and when we're in meetings together, she can just like have loads of like, pre-conversations and post-conversations, completely away from the topic at hand. And my brain is going, get on to the conversation. Like, but I'm having to sit there like just smiling. And I've always just assumed it's just because I am irritable and I'm impatient, and that's it. But it's quite interesting to hear that seems like it's similar to how your brain works.
Yeah, I just think I've got a really low tolerance to boredom.
Yeah.
And
can you relax well? Like, can you go home and switch off?
No. No, and it frustrates Tanya, my girlfriend, that we can't just sit and watch a film in the evening, and because even though I'm on the sofa with her sometimes and my arms around her and we're watching Harry Potter or whatever it is, my mind is in the office and it's thinking about the next guest or the next post or whatever it is that's going on in my professional life. So it's when I get that thing that really ignites my brain, and at the moment it's the ADHD Chatter podcast. Before it was social media broadly and Unilad and LADbible. I almost get addicted to that supply of dopamine. And I've spoken to professionals about this, and that's why I think that I've turned to alcohol and really had an issue there when I had that tap turned off.
To switch your brain off or to chase dopamine?
So like alcohol would give me the dopamine
right
that the social media was giving me. So for example, when I had Unilad taken from me and my solicitor said, okay, you're not going to get this back. We need to fight for it in the courts. That's what turned me into an alcoholic in that period of time, because that was what I was getting my dopamine from posting content. Those likes came in, my brain was firing up, and they got stolen from me overnight. Suddenly my brain was like, okay, where am I going to get it from now? I jumped in my car, and I see that now, and I can feel that kind of addiction and that compulsion towards work with the podcast and all of the ADHD work I'm doing now.
It's a good segue into talking about the podcast, because it's obviously going incredibly well. Like you just said earlier, 400,000 plus followers now across all platforms. It's doing incredibly well. And, from myself listening to it, I think it's adding so much value. And I think that, listen, there's loads of podcasts out there these days. Everybody's doing podcasts. We're doing a podcast now. But I think that what's great about this is how niche it is and how much value those niche types of podcasts, add to people. So it'd be great to hear a little bit about what your plans are for the podcast. Obviously, you've taken a big step today and done your first face-to-face interview, got your new studio. So what are some of the plans for the upcoming, series, if you will?
I wanted to go into a studio. I've always wanted to have a studio. And I was so terrified of it being another boom or bust cycle. That's why I didn't go straight into a studio.
Yeah.
I did 25 episodes from my flat.
Yeah.
In my boxers sometimes, but I was below the camera. just completely.
Yeah.
But my head was in it, and 25 episodes later, the motivation is still there. As strong as it was at the beginning. So I've leveled up into a studio, and it's just to really keep delivering value, to speak to as many people as possible, like a huge diversity of guests. Loads of people, different careers, different levels in their careers, sportsmen, celebrities, unknown people with amazing stories, doctors, academics, all sorts. But to bring relatability, value, insights into, I think there's twofold. It's making people feel heard and seen. It's allowing people to listen to a podcast and going, oh, I'm not the only one that struggles in that situation. I think that's massively beneficial. That might be more beneficial than hearing a doctor say, or an academic say, you can do this or that to make it better. I think actually a lot of the shame and the depression, and because there are a lot of comorbidities with ADHD, often just comes from the low self-esteem that being unable to function as you think a human being should gives, and hearing other people say that they deal with that as well can be really alleviating.
And have been successful. And how different each of the, as I was saying earlier, they're all so different. Every guest you've had, of course there's similarities. Of course there's patterns of impulsivity or, hyperfocus, but there's just as many people that have been on your podcast that talk about not being able to put focus. So I think that, as you say, that normalization of neurodivergence and taking away that stigma is so valuable for people. And you must be getting so many people trying to contact you to talk about themselves and, their diagnosis or their journey.
Yeah, massively. I mean, my DMs on Instagram and TikTok are full. It's overwhelming. I love to lie in bed some nights and just reply to as many as possible. And the appreciation when I do that is, you can see it. But it's just validation of how much this content is needed. Every message has a similar tone. It's like, thank you so much for making me feel seen. Thank you so much for letting me know what I can do to alleviate some of the downsides of ADHD. Thank you for highlighting the positives, because there are many. The whole point of the podcast is to just create more of a balanced narrative, because there's such a negative narrative still around ADHD. Oh, you're a problem child, you're going to be a liability at work, you're this and that. And actually, if you manage it well, and there are a lot of strengths to lean into, and if you have that awareness, like I've seen a lot of my guests do, then you can really use it to achieve amazing things.
That is something that I think actually is a really key pattern, at least from the episodes that I've listened to, is a lot of your guests have that awareness of this, the not just the strengths of their ADHD, but their weaknesses and what they need to do when those weaknesses flare up, if you will, whether it's like taking a day off or like going away from social media or whatever it may be. And I think that what you're doing is creating that awareness of all those different traits and situations, not just raising awareness of ADHD. It's teaching people how to almost, I guess, take the good bits from ADHD, but also deal with the bad bits of ADHD. Did you have any idea that it would do so well when you first started? Like, did you think the audience would be there? Because in fact, when people go this niche in terms of a subject and a podcast, and I know neurodivergence has grown obviously over the past 5 or 6 years, but did you have any idea that it would have this strong an impact and this big of a community at this stage?
No, I mean, I thought that I would get to where I am. I thought it might take 2 years.
Yeah.
It's taken 5 months to get to 6 months when I get to like 500,000. I think it's just, I always start off my videos by like addressing a point, like a really specific point, and then I really like deliver a solution, and I make sure that I just bring on guests that do the same. My first video that I just said if you Google ADHD, it just says struggle with focus, struggle with concentration, struggle with all of the negatives. And I said, well, actually, yeah, okay, some of that is true, but it also means that you can hyperfocus and you have amazing intuition and you've got incredible pattern recognition and you're resilient and great in a crisis and all these kind of things. And that really blew up. I got like 7 million views and it was a straight off the bat. And that's really what kickstarted it. And all of the comments were just like, finally, someone's addressing the positives about it, because there are lots.
Sorry to interrupt, but that what you just said there about being great in a crisis, there's no way that is on the Google definition of ADHD. There's just no way that they're putting that there. But the people that I know who've got ADHD, I would say they are great in a crisis. They can adapt. They kind of, how to put this? They almost revel in it. They that's when they get that dopamine hit, maybe. Is that something that you found as to be one of your strengths in business? You were really good when a crisis hit.
Yeah, massively. I think it's, when I go back to the pandemic, for example, just away from business for a second. I think that was when I was noticeably calm, and I've put out some content about this now. Like when a lot of people were panicking and we were just able to remain so calm. And there's this theory that people with ADHD if you go back to when human beings lived in tribes, we were the ones from an evolutionary point of view who were the hunter-gatherers. We were the ones that went out hunting and would tend to the fire throughout the night and be on lookout for predators. But now you obviously fast forward to modern day and those skills aren't required anymore. So of course we're going to struggle sometimes if that's what sets us. But when there's a genuine crisis, that flares up that part of our brain and we're able to remain really, really calm and navigate a path to the solution.
So interesting. I can't have somebody that's made a huge social media company on the podcast talking about ADHD without asking what you think the impact of social media has been on people with ADHD. Because I've read articles about how social media is causing ADHD in kids. I've read articles that have said that it's making it worse. I've had other people say it's a load of bollocks. So where do you stand on social media's impact on ADHD?
I don't think that social media causes ADHD. I think, in my opinion, I think the scientific consensus is that you're born with ADHD. Like it's a hereditary condition. It's genetic. I don't think anything causes it. I think certain lifestyle factors can amplify the traits. A lot of people during the pandemic and now during the cost of living crisis are showing ADHD traits because of a reaction to stress. But that doesn't mean they have ADHD. ADHD has to be with you from, and it's, the criteria, the diagnostic criteria is it has to have caused you significant problems in your life. And, you could argue that, and maybe, okay, why can't it have caused you considerable strengths? But I think there's a lot of content around ADHD. I think a lot of it is good. I think a lot of it is really bad. I think a lot of influencers in the space, content creators, are getting a bit carried away and chasing likes by kind of just silifying and just making some, ridiculous content like crossing a road and getting hit. I literally saw one where someone got hit by a car and they were like, "Oh, my ADHD," and it got like millions of views. And this is what young people are watching and thinking and seeing that. Without a doubt, ADHD content on social media is why we're seeing such an influx of people seeking assessment, because it's good and bad. They're recognizing it and realizing that might be the reason why they struggle or excel in certain situations. So that's what sort of opened up but I think there is a responsibility of content creators to be balanced and to be more scientific and without naming, I think there are some content creators who are just getting a bit carried away and being quite irresponsible with content creation.
Do you think that with this, listen, like without social media, your podcast couldn't exist, so you couldn't create the awareness that you're creating, and other creators who are making valuable content about ADHD. Without social media, they couldn't share that awareness. So it obviously is a good thing in that sense. Do you think that there's I don't want to say like a fear, but do you think there is with so many people now going, oh, I'm doing it now. I might have ADHD because of the awareness that people are showing. Could there be a worry that people might get misdiagnosed? Like too many people might get now misdiagnosed with ADHD if they do go private and they pay the 900 quid and they get that, yep, got ADHD, when really they might not have ADHD. Like, do you think the diagnosis process is strong enough to stop that from happening? Because when I go on, it sounds stupid, but when I go on all the ADHD websites about doing an online assessment, and obviously they're all very clear this is not an assessment, they're almost pushing you towards one mindset of ADHD. It's always the disorganized, impulsive. It's never the hyperfocus. It's never the good in a crisis answers. They kind of wanting you to say, I'm disorganized, impulsive, all of the like typical things that we've got told of an ADHD person. So do you think that the diagnosis process is robust enough to make sure that there isn't misdiagnosis en masse if so many people are getting tested?
I think with anything that is subjective, it's not like if you've got diabetes, you can go for a blood test and that's very objective. You either do or you don't have it, right? It's a very black and white binary diagnosis with ADHD, and a lot of neurodivergent conditions are very subjective. So essentially it's, you speak to a psychiatrist and they form an opinion based on balance about what you say. So with anything that's diagnosed like that, there's always going to be room for misdiagnosis and errors. I think the vast majority of people who go for an assessment aren't going because they want to get a cool, trendy label. They're going because they know that they have ADHD. They know that they need a diagnosis to get support, whether that's medication or other support, and they're at a genuine point of crisis. So I think for that reason, I think that misdiagnosis is probably not very common. I think that with anything where there's a huge demand, which is social media content creation on this topic has caused, there's always going to be profiteering and private clinics that are perhaps not being as thorough as they should be. My assessment was 4 lengthy questionnaires that really delved into my early years and throughout my life, because you have to show that it's been a consistent. I mean, at the moment, it's a consistent problem throughout your life. And then that was done by my parents and my long-term partner. And then you have a 2-hour interview with a qualified psychologist, and they come to a judgment at the end of that. And I think, so it's subjective. So there will always be room for misdiagnosis, and it is essentially down to the opinion of a professional. I mean, if only there was, a more objective test for it.
It's very difficult, as we've talked about today. The nuances between one person to another is vast. So I usually end each podcast by asking somebody what their biggest lesson in life or biggest lesson in business has been. But I'd like to ask you, if you were talking to somebody, let's call them a teenager now, they've got ambitions of going into business, but they've got ADHD and they've been told, you'll never do that. You'll never succeed because, one teacher's told them they're naughty or whatever it may be. What would be your message to somebody that's got ADHD, that's wanting to go into business, in terms of how they can harness it to make sure that they are successful and they can go for it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably, don't listen to the teacher. I think there's a lot of narratives going to young people to say that they're broken and this kind of stuff. If they're acting in a certain way, then they need to be fixed. And I think that's very damaging. I think kids should be encouraged to lean into the characteristics that they're showing, especially if they're showing positive ones that are creative or entrepreneurial. Like, they should be encouraged to lean into those. I think trust your intuition. I think people with ADHD seem to have incredible intuition, like great judges of character, great trend spotters. Like, generally, if you're acting out on an impulse where you think that's like a business idea, it's probably a good idea.
Yeah,
it's probably like, we have that intuition. Do a lot of soul searching, a lot of journaling, a lot of like meditation, a lot of exercises to build your self-awareness. Like, understand where your strengths are, understand where you perhaps need to ask for help. Because, none of us are good at everything. I think it's quite tempting when you have ADHD to try and do everything on your own. And from my experience and speaking to others, that's when you have issues with sustainability and things crash down a bit when you try and do everything and burnout happens and you end up abandoning stuff because just the overwhelm gets too much. But actually, if you just keep a really straightforward journal and simple things, like just a practical bit of advice, like this has really helped me in the last couple of years. I always plan my day the night before, because my mind is alive and at its best late at night, and it's the worst in the morning. I know that's like, but again, going back to that sort of like the exaggerated peaks and troughs. Like, I am pretty much useless for the first 2 hours of the day, but if I can use my brain from the previous night and sit down and really plan out my day, then I'm giving myself a head start in the morning. Like, simple things like that. And that's what I've learned from like years of self-awareness. So understand where your strengths are and don't be afraid to ask for help.
Amazing. Alec, thank you so much for coming on. It's been very eye-opening for me. I hope it has for other people. If people want to come and find your podcast, where can they find it?
Oh, anywhere. ADHD Chatter searched on any podcast app or YouTube.
Perfect. Alex, thanks so much.
Thank you very much.